Welcome to the 19th Century Charitable Association in Oak Park, where it is our vision to be a dynamic cultural center for community learning. I am Deb W. Hammond. I am the program co-director, and I am also the literature chair. We have 30 programs this season in our enrichment series, and they are a part of our mission to strengthen our community through learning, giving, and sharing our landmark building. Today's program is Why Bookstores Matter in the 21st Century. I am very pleased to introduce author and bookseller Jeff Deutsch. He is director of the Hyde Park Seminary Co-op Bookstore, which he first visited as a teen and never forgot. In 2019, he worked to turn this academic bookstore into a nonprofit whose mission is bookselling. He managed bookstores previously at Stanford and Berkeley before returning to Chicago, where he and his wife live with their menagerie down in Beverly. He will discuss the importance of bookstores in his new book, In Praise of Good Bookstores.
In 1963, the sociologist Edward Shills, in an essay entitled The Bookshop in America, wrote, "It may well be that we live in an epoch in which the bookshop is an institution suspended between the dying old society and the society struggling to be born." In 1994, there were approximately 7,000 independent bookstores in the US. Now, there are about 2,500. There are so few bookstores, and of the bookstores left, even fewer bookstores that sell books exclusively. Neither of these facts are incidental. In the 21st century, readers no longer need bookstores to buy books. And furthermore, from a retail perspective, the net profit from book sales alone is not sufficient to support bookselling as a financial endeavor. So if we no longer need bookstores to buy books, why then do we still need bookstores? And what in the 21st century makes a good bookshop? Whatever answer we provide must begin with the presence of books and the impulse to browse those books. The best argument on behalf of bookstores is the bookstores themselves, those that created an improbable place whose sheer existence provided a value to their bookish communities that far exceeded their financial dividends. Ultimately, the question we are asking today is, what society, struggling to be born, do we hope to bear? What a strange thing, the bookshop. There are just so many books. There are more than 20 million published books available, not counting books published this year. And every book requires considerable attention to write, publish, sell, and read. Books serve such diverse purposes, and they are written for so few readers at a given time. As such, efficiencies common to other industries are impossible for the book industry. The remarkable and perhaps unique thing about the good bookstore is that it has never counted on the blockbuster, or what Edward Shills described as overstuffed political books and puffy and pallid biographies. Never counted on those to thrive, but on thousands and thousands of singular products that must be patiently left on the shelves, rendering capital inert, as it were, until their destined readers discovered them. John Ruskin, the 19th century art critic and armchair political economist, in his 1891 lecture, Sesame and Lilies, writes of books of the hour and books of all time, noting, of course, that this isn't a distinction of quality. There are good and bad books of the hour and good and bad books of all time, but of species. If the conventional wisdom is to be believed, there are books of the hour that one must read in order to participate in the cultural conversation, and books of all time that everyone is meant to have read. But this is not the case, of course, and that is one of the great virtues of the book trade and the reading public. Surely there are books of either category that enough people have read that it seems like everyone is reading or has read them, but we booksellers know that the conventional wisdom is false and has little bearing on the work of bookselling. The bookstore is a haven for the heterodox. The books that comprise the Good Bookstore's collection might have been published a month ago, a year ago, a half-century ago, a couple of millennia ago. The attuned bookseller must provide a selection of books of all vintages. In order to do so, the work of bookselling demands not just a firm grasp of the literature of the ages, but of the literature of one's lifetime, and the publishers' catalogs that arrive seasonally and by the dozens, announcing thousands upon thousands of new publications. Only a minute fraction of the books one considers will make the shelves. Discernment is the primary quality of the good bookseller. Filtration, selection, assemblage, and enthusiasm, their work. As a business proposition, this model is clearly untenable. No retailer whose work is to buy cheap and sell dear would develop the business of the bookstore. The newspaperman H.L. Mencken, speaking to the same point in his 1930 essay, Lo, the Poor Bookseller, writes, "The marvel is indeed that the bookseller ever survives at all. It is as if a haberdasher, in addition to meeting all the hazards of the current fashion, had to keep in stock a specimen of every kind of shirt, collar, sock, necktie, and undershirt in favor since 1750. 90-odd years later, our conundrum hasn't changed, even if the books and authors have. Our customers might find our stock insufficient if we don't offer the latest Ta-Nehisi Coates or Elena Ferrante, while another less contemporary reader might be disappointed if they can't find the 25-year-old volumes by Bell Hooks or Elizabeth Hardwick. And that same bookseller must know, say, a decade from now, which Coates, which Ferrante, if any, to keep on the shelf, and which, if any, to let go. On these points, writing at the same time as Mencken, the novelist and enthusiast on behalf of bookstores, Christopher Morley, understood our challenge well. The bookseller, he writes, has to combine the functions of the bar room and the bodega. He must be able to serve on demand not only the cocktail of the moment, but also the scarcest of old vintages. How rare is the publican who understands the merits of both? It's clear that the business of bookselling is secondary for most booksellers, which is why they will find creative ways to make profits elsewhere. It's clear that the business of bookselling is secondary for most booksellers, which is why they will find creative ways to make profits elsewhere, that they might continue to sell the sorts of books that drew them to the work in the first place. Most of them, too, would expect the likes of Coates, Ferrante, Hooks, and Hardwick on the shelves of any good bookstore. In our time, bookstores have taken to selling everything from socks to coffee, as they did to, quote, dealing in pen wipers, blotters, writing pads, and greeting cards, or gramophone discs in Schulz's time. And of course, we understand why. They need the margin. I have been a bookseller since 1994, and throughout my career, I have operated these sorts of stores. The pull of the presence of books is so strong that I have, without pride, but without shame, supplemented the book collection with notebooks, coffee, greeting cards, and other sidelines, thinking it a reasonable compromise to maintain a decent bookstore. And it is. Even decent bookstores, I would argue, are tremendously important to a thriving community, but they are not representative of our highest aspirations. Neither, of course, is the largest and most mercenary seller of books in the world, Amazon. In fact, the work of bookselling is completely circumvented. This 21st century model of selling books is an everything store that does away with filtration, selection, assemblage, and enthusiasm entirely. Jeff Bezos, in a talk delivered to the Special Libraries Conference in 1997, explained that he chose books as the first product his new company would sell because, quote, there are more items in the book category than there are items in any other category by far. In addition, their relatively uniform size made them easy to pack and ship. That Bezos then turned books into loss leaders, which are products sold at a loss in order to attract customers who will then purchase higher margin products, creating profitable transactions. So that Bezos turned books into loss leaders is particularly unsavory, considering professional booksellers have long placed a higher value on their cultural work than on the tremendous effort required to achieve even thin margins selling books. They needed to sell socks in order to make bookselling profitable. Bezos chose to devalue books in order to make already profitable merchandise, like socks, even more profitable. But lest we give ourselves over to lamentation, let's consider a different sort of bookstore, Chicago Seminary Co-op. In 1961, 5 students of the Chicago Theological Seminary established a consumer cooperative whose purpose was, quote, to make available primarily to students, faculty members, and administrative officers of theological seminaries and other scholastic institutions located at or near the campus of the University of Chicago, books, publications, and supplies used in the study of theology and for building up by such persons seminaries or institutions of their professional and scholarly libraries. The second article of the incorporation reads in full, the name of the association is the Seminary Co-op Bookstores, Inc. Edward Shills was a member of the University of Chicago's faculty in 1961, holding joint appointments in sociology and the Committee on Social Thought. Perhaps the early booksellers of the Seminary Co-op read Shills's essay. In 1969, the general manager of the co-op, John Moscheidler, hired Jack Sella, who began his 40-year tenure as the leader of the co-op in 1973. There's little doubt Shills expressed his opinions to the 7 shopkeepers running the bookstores in Hyde Park at the time, including Sella. Shills had a reputation for many things, but timidity expressing his opinions on matters of the intellect was certainly not one. If they hadn't read the essay, they likely heard Shills express his anathemas in their shops. In 1978, Shills became the 8,704th member of the Seminary Co-op. As bookselling in general is an unlikely and perhaps unwise business, serious bookselling must be an extraordinarily foolish financial endeavor. Why should anyone who has or who can obtain $10,000 or $20,000, asks Shills, invested in a bookshop to sell serious books, when if he were an economically reasonable person, he would do better to open a beauty parlor or a hamburger and barbecue shop, or put his money into the stock markets? Shill's question is rhetorical. He knew why. Sella and Moscheidler knew why. If the aim of a reasonable person is to live a life of meaning and purpose, serious books can provide the concentrate of the examined life. In the last 3 decades of the 20th century, Sella and the Legion booksellers who worked beside him built arguably the best serious bookstore in America. They ignored the incredibly specific purpose for which the bookstore was established and built an expansive institution. Good bookstores reflect their communities. Exceptional bookstores both reflect and create their communities. In those early years, the Seminary Co-op did both superbly. Upon Sella's retirement in 2013, the philosopher, Jonathan Lear, a longtime co-op member, wondered about his successor. Quote, where does one post the help wanted ad? Looking for a soul or souls willing to be incarnate in a bookstore. Sometimes the mere existence of a phenomenon, a human, an institution, a work of art is worthy of awe, creating a declaration that cannot be countermanded. When I first descended the perilous staircase leading to the old co-op in 1994, incidentally the year Amazon was founded, the bookstore was in its heyday. Like many who came before and after me, I was deeply persuaded by the Seminary Co-op's existence. The bookstore was a realization of a humble but powerful vision, a broad selection of books whose presence on the shelves created an unparalleled browsing experience that was not diluted by tchotchkes or knickknacks, pen wipers or gramophone discs, and only the occasional puffy or pallid volume. The landscapes through which we move, in which we are perpetually immersed, are the networks of relations through which we develop an understanding of ourselves and others, and our collective place in the world. The perpetual unfolding of this world of perception against which we measure ourselves is what we mean when we consider our landscapes. The novelist Marilyn Robinson wrote that the great service a community performs for its members is giving a sense of the possible, which, if the community is ungenerous, is the great disservice the community performs. For those who know how to use them, these book spaces are a model of the generosity a community might offer its citizens. The seminary co-op's collection created a totalizing environment. Engagement with this landscape of book spines shifted the patron's sense of space, time, abundance, value, and community. To a confused and restless young man trying to find his way in the world, who knew only that the presence of books was of paramount importance, the co-op seemed as close to a spiritual home as I had hoped to find. It was, in fact, a religion predicated upon books from which I was attempting to take my leave. But even then I knew that whatever else was left behind, the presence of books would remain. I grew up in an Orthodox Jewish community in and around Brooklyn, New York. The rooms of my childhood in Flatbush, Borough Park, and Elizabeth, New Jersey were all book-lined. My childhood homes, my yeshiva, my shul, my relatives' homes, and the homes of my friends' families were heavy with large books. My grandparents had a second-floor walk-up apartment in Borough Park on the corner of 16th Avenue and 53rd Street that they rented from 1957 until 2012. My grandfather's library, or rather book-lined living room, in Borough Park made a particular impression. The bookcases were filled with books whose gravity was clear from the ornate, uniform spines. Ornate, these books, but not ornamental. The bookshelves always had gaps, and the gaps would move from week to week. An ever-rotating selection of volumes were laid out on my grandfather's bookstand and desk. These books were read. Books are for use, after all, and they were treated with reverence and love. Observant Jews are accustomed to kissing the cover of a book after closing it, a habit that has remained with me throughout the years. Along with the British literatus Leigh Hunt, who, in effusing about books, wrote of how he liked to lean his head against them, followers of my given tradition might say when I speak of being in contact with books, I mean it literally. These books were read in groups called chavrusas, a Hebrew word whose root means friend. When I was a young boy, I would join my grandfather's chavrusa on occasion just to observe. Seated on an austere bench in the basement of the shul across the street, my head barely clearing the tabletop, I sat with the large men and their large Aramaic books, watching them question, ponder, argue with, and delight in what they found on those pages. My grandfather wasn't a scholar, he was a shopkeep. He ran a suit store named Chatham Clothes on New Utrecht Avenue, selling kosher clothing to the Haredi Jews in the tri-state area. He worked long days, after which he would eat dinner with his family and head across the street to learn with his chavrusa. The activity called learning was common because there was only one thing to study, the Tanakh and its many commentaries, especially the Talmud. There was no need to specify the object of learning. Learning was a daily activity, regardless of one's age, and was no less special for being an everyday endeavor. And learning, while it reliably yielded wisdom and pleasure, was understood to be an end in itself. The highest compliment one could pay in that community was that someone was learned, or a Talmid Chacham, a wise student. When as a teenager I moved into the secular world, I found some of the conventions around books and education profoundly alien. I couldn't fathom the notion that one strove to become educated rather than learned, or that one might study in order to make a living rather than learn continually, an endeavor essential to living a more meaningful life. What, after all, was the point of making a living if not to build community and to create deeper understanding? Come home for dinner and then learn with one's chavrusa. The Chicago poet Nate Marshall once said during an event at the Co-op that the greatest thing a poet or poem can give you is permission. The bookstore, too, it turns out, can give you permission. That is precisely what the first descent into the Co-op established for me. Permission to be among books outside of an institution of learning, be it a university or a yeshiva, and outside of a teleological paradigm. I remember how awestruck I was on that first descent. It recalled British essayist Charles Lamb's remembrances of his first engagement with the library at Oxford. He writes, "What a place to be in is an old library. It seems as though all the souls of all the writers that have bequeathed their labors to these Bodleians were reposing here as if in some dormitory or middle state. I do not want a handle to profane the leaves, their winding sheets. I could as soon dislodge a shade. I seem to inhale learning, walking amid their foliage, and the odor of their old moth-scented coverings is fragrant as the first blossom of the sciential apples which grew amid the happy orchard." Following my grandfather's model, books aren't ornaments, knowing that there were treasures to be found within the volumes, I quickly became fearless in dislodging shades. As my intellectual life was developed in the interstices between the yeshiva and the academy, the justification of the existence of a bookstore like Seminary Co-op was to me self-evident. This was the place where one could become learned, a Talmid Chacham, and fashion a daily practice that would lead one through a more meaningful life. The philosopher Francis Bacon's musings on the pleasure and delight of knowledge and learning would not have been out of place in the Talmud. "We see in all other pleasures," he writes with the perspicacity of one of the rabbinic fathers, "that there is satiety, and after they be used, their verdure departeth, which shows well they be but deceits of pleasures, and not pleasures. And that it was the novelty which pleased, and not the quality. And therefore we see that voluptuous men turn friars, and ambitious princes turn melancholy. But of knowledge there is no satiety, but satisfaction and appetite are perpetually interchangeable." The best parts of the tradition in which I was raised valued the enduring, and it valued meaningful ephemera, what the philosopher Simone Weil gestured toward when she wrote, "Stars and blossoming fruit trees, utter permanence and extreme fragility give one an equal sense of eternity." It sought pleasures, not the deceits of pleasures. It sought to feed appetites whose satiety led to a satisfaction that endured, and which led to an appetite for further meaning, knowledge, and love, a pleasure whose verdure remains. A simple and direct justification of bookstores no longer holds. We no longer need bookstores to buy books, even serious books. In fact, bookstores might well be an inefficient and inconvenient way to buy books in the 21st century. And it's certainly the case that we have become creatures of efficiency and convenience. But efficiency is an inconsistent ideal, a dubious virtue. In fact, there are wise inefficiencies, as any artist or parent can attest. Like the readers they serve, booksellers embrace the inefficient elements of the bookstore, understanding that they are anything but wasteful. given that they are not only deliberate but critical to creating a good bookstore, the time has come to no longer apologize for the inefficiencies inherent in good bookselling. The inherited model of retail with which bookstores were established is insufficient. We must recognize and then rectify the considerable devaluing of the work of booksellers in building spaces that contribute to a more learned, more understanding, and more fulfilled populace. After the legendary Parisian bookshop Lune shut its doors in 2015, Adam Gopnik noted, "When a bookstore closes, an argument ends." In the spring of 2020, we experienced the silence. The argument miraculously merely paused. For nearly 60 years in times of uncertainty, our community has descended upon the bookstore, looking for camaraderie, meaning, and provisions for the journey, as they tried to understand ruptures, global and personal. The rupture of March 2020 was different. The pull of the place itself suddenly seemed like a danger, not a salve to our community. The density of the crowd was not comforting, as it had been in the past. It was terrifying. For the first time in our history, and for what ended up lasting 441 days, the doors of the seminary co-op were closed for an extended period. During the closure, these bookstores, bereft of their community indefinitely, were not in different spaces, to use Bachelar's term. They weren't subject to the measures and estimates of the surveyor. They were haunted spaces, thick with ghosts. While the booksellers worked in the stores among books during the entirety of the COVID pandemic, even during the frenetic and terrifying spring season, we found ourselves operating a warehouse fulfillment center, not a bookstore. It might seem obvious to note that there is a significant difference between the two, but considering the fact that our industry is now built to support warehouse fulfillment centers and not bookstores, it's important to clearly mark the difference. Bookstores are roused by their patrons. It is the encounter that fulfills a bookstore's purpose. Reopening the doors in June 2021 felt like a resuscitation first, then a revival. If an argument ends when a bookstore closes, then what argument is continued when a bookstore remains open? Ultimately, the fundamental argument the good bookstore posits is that it should exist, that the culture and community it creates is justification enough. According to Ilan Stavens, the scholar of Latin American literature, Jorge Luis Borges so identified with the culture of Judaism that he rigorously sought a genealogical connection to the Jewish people, to no avail. In response, Stavens writes, Borges simply imagined himself a Jew. What was it about the culture of the Jews that created such an affinity in Borges? The Jews are a people who are raised to question, interrogate even, their God. They do so through commentary primarily, not criticism. Their libraries, like my grandfather's, composed of volumes of loving expansion and repair of their canon, might be all they'll ever know as home. After all, they are fated to wander, a rootless people who are always strangers in a strange land. Without a homeland, the Jewish people made of the book their homeland. And as Jews made of their homeland a book, so Borges and I made of the library and bookstore, respectively, a homeland. My grandmother gave up the apartment in Borough Park in late 2012, 18 years after the death of my grandfather, and the same year the seminary co-op moved 1 block east, from its subterranean origins to an illuminated but still humble building adjacent to Frank Lloyd Wright's Roby House. After her death the following year, my grandparents' apartment was razed. I had a chance to visit prior to the building's demolition. As I climbed the staircase and entered the vacated apartment, I was struck by the indentation in the carpet along the living room wall. My grandfather's books had made their impermanent mark, and for the better part of an hour, I beheld that indentation, formed in space by weight and time, as though I was considering the stars and the blossoming fruit trees, reflecting upon that which remains and that which passes. In some way, we are all wandering people, wandering in search of our communities, in search of ourselves. Books and the landscapes they create, both as objects and as mechanisms to deliver the hopes, dreams, moods, principles, wisdom contained between their covers, are exceptional tools to cultivate our own interior landscape, which, after all, is our portable and permanent homeland. And so we may understand, shape, and immerse ourselves in the external world, creating what Robinson called the sense of the possible, that we might become a more generous community. I hope, like the good life or the good society, that the good bookstore can serve as our ambition. There is something distinctive about the good bookstore, the loss of which would lead to a loss of access to a particular way of being in the world. This is no eulogy. We can't allow for that. It's a celebration and a hope that the argument of the seminary co-op and its institutional kin, bookstores that create an unalloyed bookish space, will flourish for generations to come. And so rather than provide general answers, I hope to provoke questions that you as individuals and communities might consider as you develop your own arguments, support your own bookstores. How might we deliberately build a financial model for good bookstores rather than try to fit them into an inherited retail mold? Our model must recognize that the book itself is not the product, but the experience of the bookstore, its browsage, and the thoughts, conversations, and discoveries the collection evokes. How might we look to good bookstores to help provide a bookish landscape that supports conversation, contemplation, and the development of a more learned, as opposed to educated or degreed, populace? How might we accurately assess the value provided by good bookstores, those that patiently carry a mix of books of the moment and books of all time? How might we develop the profession of bookselling, that we might develop careers and offer proper remuneration for those readers of reading, booksellers, without whom good bookstores couldn't exist? How might we learn to use bookstores? How might we develop more than an inkling of what one of the great instruments can accomplish? I'll leave you with a brief bit of, we call it Dvar Torah, a little biblical story. According to the Torah, God loved Abraham. This is about books, you'll bear with me. So when God decided to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah as their sin had become grave, Abraham questioned his God. He asked how God could kill the righteous with the wicked. Shall the judge of all the earth not do justice, he implored, if 50 right people are found among the wicked? God agreed to spare the cities of the plain if 50 righteous were counted among them. Although Abraham was merely dust and ash, he wondered if 5 righteous people were missing, would that be enough to then destroy the cities? God agreed that 45 would suffice. What if 40 were found there? On account of 40, God would not act. Fearing he might be annoying God, Abraham continued, asking after 30, then 20, then 10, a number by which God agreed to save the cities. Wendy Doniger, the great scholar and wit, once said with irreverence, but not entirely facetiously, if God is looking for 10 reasons not to destroy the world, the seminary co-op would be among the first. And so it is. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much. Any thoughts on the relation of the bookstore to the library? Like our library here is kind of performing those things that you're talking about so well.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. I envy you, your library. It's one of the best in the country, truly. And it is exactly the kind of bookish space for which I'm advocating and for which the book advocates. I do speak in the second chapter a little bit about the difference between bookstores and libraries, but it's not a competition. We would really love to see both of those spaces nurtured and tended. I think one note I would be sure to touch upon is that if libraries didn't exist today, and somebody said, well, why don't we create these land trusts and put these palaces of books there that anybody can come into and anybody can take the books if they like, we would think it was an absurd sentiment. And now, the idea that there would be communities without spaces like that obviously is difficult for all of us to imagine. So the hope is that with bookstores too, we can try and imagine something for the future so that there isn't that great vacuum of book spaces. So thank you for that question.
Do you know of any bookstores that are basically nonprofit? That's their status rather than corporations or whatever?
Thank you for that question. So the Seminary Co-op is the first and currently only not-for-profit bookstore in the country whose mission is the bookstore itself, the maintenance of that bookstore. We're not 501, we're not-for-profit, so there are no owners, and the 501 status is about taxes and et cetera. We are not a co-op, and we're no longer in the seminary building. We are still a bookstore, so our name, of course, we're holding on to some things from the past, but there is an acknowledgement that the model for bookstores is completely broken. It's not a retail model. The idea that any bookstore can make its living buying and selling books alone is, if their store's doing it today, they won't be able to do it in 5 years. And so there is this call to arms for people who are browsers, who care about their bookstores, readers who care about spaces where they can discover books and browse, to help build a new model for it. And we're one of them, and we're really proud of the model we're building. We went nonprofit in 2019, and frankly, the reason I wrote my book was to kind of make the case for it. Hopefully it's a good read also, but it really is trying to, I and the publisher Princeton University Press really believed in this cause, in this idea that bookstores could be rethought and that we could answer the question of why a bookstore in the 21st century with a visionary and positive approach that privileges the things that make these stores great.
That was an interesting question and response about the relationship between bookstores and libraries. And I'm just wondering about your thoughts on the little free libraries that are all over.
I'm all for it. The more books, the better. I have a little free library in my front yard alongside a bench, and anyone in my neighborhood knows I'm in the book business, so I get a lot of great books, and that's definitely worth checking out in the Beverly neighborhood in Chicago. So no, anywhere that has bookish spaces, we'll take them. I mean, I think that there's something about all of the other ways that we find entertainment or even education and how important it is to put books everywhere, as in every room you can find.
Our son grew up in Oak Park. He did not hang out at the library. He hung out at Barbara's bookstore. And when he was a young person, really probably, he was one of the Generation X that was ignored, right? So when he was a young person walking home from school, he walked into Barbara's and he would sit in the corner and read, and they let him, which he never, he wasn't buying.
Exactly.
He came in, he wanted to read, he pulled books off the shelf, he read them, he put them back. He was a good person in the way he did it. And it occurs to me, we have these wonderful libraries, but he found, we had books at home, but he found a place for himself in a bookstore where he was welcome. And I think it's a great thing. Just wanted to echo what people were saying.
I just wanted to ask if the independent bookstores still have the ability and option to search for obscure books. And I know there's Amazon and you can search there, but books that may be out of print and that sort of thing? Do you still have that ability?
Some bookstores do. Bookstores who, if there are books that are in print, we can search them, and we carry over 100,000 books at a given time. And then used bookstores are constantly updating their stock. You've got a great bookstore around the corner, book table. Hyde Park has, in addition to the Seminary Co-op and 57th Street Books, Powell's Books, which is one of the best used bookstores in the world, and an incredible inventory. So yes, absolutely. And look, Amazon, so I really want to be careful about Amazon. Using Amazon is fine. People who want to find a book that they need, and if that's more convenient, it's understandable. Really, the question is, why do you want bookstores at all? And if so, how do you find ways to support them? So they're not mutually exclusive. And a lot of used booksellers actually use Amazon and their tools to get the books out to readers. So I'm not really against anything. I'm 100% enthusiast. That's what booksellers do, and I just want to share the good news about bookstores, but also acknowledge that if we don't build a model for them, they'll go away.
You're a 501c something or other. No?
We're a not-for-profit. We're incorporated as a not-for-profit corporation. We don't have a 501 status because we don't want to pretend to be something we're not, and there isn't currently an exemption for bookstores. So there's no incentive for us to be a 501.
So then how do you have to bring in more money than you spend, or you're not going to survive? So what is your financial structure?
Correct. So it's exactly that. We take in donations. We have, it's just they're not tax deductible. And then we also sell services that are around bookselling. So we have a consulting business. We do things with other performance areas where we help curate speakers and things like that. But ultimately, it's about asking individuals, municipalities, institutions, and others in the industry to pay for the work that they believe in. And we've really gotten away from this idea of it being a charitable contribution. It's not. It's people are paying for something of value that we are just now starting to qualify, and has been very difficult to quantify historically, really like any other not-for-profit. I mean, quantifying a not-for-profit is not easy, nor any executive director will tell you is qualifying what makes it great. And so finding ways to support it, that's exactly what we do. We have been able to make ends meet with this model, but really the goal for me and my colleagues and the board is to stop apologizing for it and to not have this constant crisis of we're not going to make it if we don't suddenly shore up a bunch of money. Like I know there was a GoFundMe at Booktable during COVID, and they're incredible booksellers doing great work, but we don't want this perpetual crisis mentality. We want to find a way, like any other nonprofit, to make it work, and why it should be tied to tax exemption and wealth management, where we don't see any reason why it should be. If the IRS did offer that, we certainly would consider it and probably do it, but it's more important to us to state explicitly what it is we're trying to do than try and fit it into an existing category, just like we used to do with retail, and we don't want to do that anymore.
Well, I really just can't see how you can bring in enough money then.
I hope you're wrong, and I so appreciate that. And I thank you, because the fact is, I have my work cut out for me, but I'll tell you this, it's less likely that we'll succeed by buying and selling books that don't make any money either. And so we want to, this is the point. And you're right, it's going to be really hard. You're not wrong. Also an optimist. I'm a complete optimist. So I'm a realist, but I'm an optimist. We'll get there.
Thank you for a very personal approach to this. I think that was really meaningful to a lot of us. My question is, where are the publishers in all of this? Wouldn't you think they would have some skin in the game, and it would be to their advantage to be very supportive?
That's such a great question. The question was, where are the publishers in all of this? Don't you think they would have skin in the game to keep these stores going? They do a great job of supporting stores overall, but they're not in much better shape than we are. And that whole idea that I was talking about books of the moment and books of all time, I think is a really important concept in understanding how publishers work and how bookstores work. So Prince Harry's biography sold like a commodity. It was bought and sold, and it made money for the publisher and for the stores who sold it, and Amazon and other, airport bookstores, places like that, who are retailers. They buy and sell. But we're the stores where you can get more obscure titles, scholarly titles, older books, and how do we build a different model to support them? And so we're trying to bring the publishers along and say, why do you want a bookstore in the 21st century? They do support us. They don't have a lot of extra money themselves. And how do we come together as an industry? And it includes libraries, it includes authors, it includes cultural programmers like you, like the space, and say, why do we care about this work and how do we finance it? And come together to seek it from those to whom it is of value, which is frankly why all that Edward Shill's talk, we really are thinking about this as a societal need, and where do you have a public square? Where do you have dialogue across difference? Where do you have people coming together and seeing the best of time and space? I mean, you can walk into a bookstore and you're transported back a few hundred years across the globe. I saw the map at the front of the room. There are very few places where you can do that, and how do you deliberately build it and then find economic models to support it?
How important are author signings to a bookstore such as yours in selling books? And second, are publishers cutting back on marketing, and is that affecting the number of authors who can come by and give talks and signings?
It's a good question. How important are author talks? Pre-pandemic, we're doing about 700 a year. And now we're doing about 350, and our goal is to lose $1, and we fail at that goal. They're not important overall for making money, and they're also not important overall for the cultural mission, or I shouldn't say, they're not the primary importance for the mission, but they do bring a lot of people in the stores, and they support the author's work in ways that we care about, and we're going to continue doing them as long as we can. Now, the Prince Harry model is the same. So if you get a major author, then it will, we had a Rachel Maddow event that brought in $30,000 in a day. And that's obviously, incredible. Now that's top line. Bottom line is probably about, $5,000, but still, that's a really good number. But that has to pay for a lot of books by university presses or poets or novelists that aren't going to bring in that kind of money.
This organization is a 501c3. The number comes from the IRS code, and it's a charitable nonprofit. They are a nonprofit, but not a charitable nonprofit, hopefully.
We're not a tax-exempt nonprofit, or the tax code doesn't affect. So if we made money, we would pay taxes. If a 501c3 makes money, they don't pay taxes. And if someone were to give us money, it would be tax deductible for the donor, but for 501c3, but not for us. It is not tax deductible.
When I was in graduate school, there were a number of publishers, reprint publishers, that, in your division between current books and books of everlasting value, you could get from these reprint publishers books that had long been out of print. To what extent now do you have these reprint publishers?
They're still going strong, and places like Dover Books and a lot of yeah, absolutely. And nice editions of those books, absolutely. It's a small percentage of the overall market. Most readers are not looking for those books, and there's a glut of those.
I know libraries have had a lot of issues with book bans. And I wanted to know, has your bookstore has that kind of thing, any of that, and if you have, how have you dealt with it?
That's such a great question. It's about book bans and how libraries have had book bans. Fortunately, we have not had any issues. Being on the south side of Chicago, I think, makes that easier. I just returned from a national book selling conference last week, and there are plenty of stores who are dealing with that. And in prior stores had issues. It's less about banning and more about just really what they call doxing, where people are just calling from throughout the country and yelling at the stores and just trying to be general menaces, and it's awful. And what's happening in so many red and purple states around book banning is we should all be terribly frightened. This isn't my area of expertise, but and we do live in a state where there was a law signed protecting, the opposite, that books will not be banned, but there's a case that's happening right now in Texas that the American Bookseller Association is involved with closely, because it would mean that bookstores can't sell to schools unless they give a rating, a content rating to every single book and stand behind it, and then they can personally be held liable if they're selling obscene materials. It's absolutely horrifying what's happening. Thankfully, we personally haven't been exposed to it, but everyone should be afraid.
So much is being published on the web. It seems to me that's your biggest competition these days. I mean, I'm getting more than I can ever get read just on the web.
Yeah. Well, I think that's part of thank you for that question. And I think that's part of the point around why do we want bookstores, and also the point about why do we want books. So for many, for a long time, books were just content. And that's really no longer the case. Now it's about the physicality of the object, the way that it shuts out all of that other information you don't want. How often do you start a book and you read a sentence or two, and then you go check your phone, and then you read another paragraph, and really to shut all of that out is important, especially to young people. It's actually inspiring to see young 20-somethings and 30-somethings returning to the book because of what it doesn't include. And so I think we should look to books, bookstores, booksellers, for different things than we might look to content creators and film, Netflix, and play, that's a big competitor. And champion, and all of you, champion what you have found in books, what you have found in bookstores and libraries for the next generation, because without that good news and spreading the gospel, forgive me, I think in religious metaphors, it could go away. And I think that there are so many people who grow up without bookstores in their neighborhood and without good libraries. And so what would happen if those seminal experiences were not perpetuated throughout? So thank you all. Thanks for putting up with me and my tickle in my throat. I really appreciate